Millionaire sees homeless woman with twins, then recognizes her ring and uncovers a shocking truth. Life has a cruel way of stealing what we hold dear, leaving only memories and unanswered questions. For years he built an empire, believing that the past had been buried forever. But one night, as he walks through the city, his world comes to a halt. A woman, frail and lost, clutches two small children in her arms. He almost looks away until his eyes catch something impossible, a silver ring, the very same one he gave to the only woman he ever truly loved. How could this be? She was gone, disappeared without a trace, and yet here she is, alone, broken, and pretending not to know him. What is she hiding? And worse, what was stolen from him without his knowledge? This is another breathtaking story from Living Narratives, where you truly feel the power of stories that make you reflect on life. Tell us where you're watching from and prepare yourself for a tale filled with love, loss, and a truth that was never meant to be uncovered. The moment Ethan Montgomery's car halted at the red light, his eyes wandered from the glowing screen of his phone to the city streets. He had no real interest in the passing scenery, but something unusual caught his attention. A woman sitting on the sidewalk, her arms wrapped tightly around two small girls. She was hunched over, shielding them as if the world itself was something to be endured rather than lived in. Her clothes were faded, mismatched, and oversized, the kind of attire that spoke of years of hardship. Something about her posture, the way she held the children so protectively, stirred something in him, an odd familiarity. He frowned, shaking off the feeling. He didn't have time for distractions, especially not tonight. His life was built on focus, on forward motion. Yet, as the car inched forward, a small movement caught his eye. The woman shifted slightly, her hand brushing against the dim glow of a street lamp, and that's when he saw it. A silver ring, a simple band with an engraving along the side. His breath stalled. He knew that ring. He had placed it on Emily Carter's finger years ago. His pulse quickened, though he refused to acknowledge the reason why. It had to be a coincidence. The city was filled with forgotten people, with lost faces and misplaced memories. It wasn't her. It couldn't be. And yet, he found himself craning his neck slightly, trying to see more before the moment slipped away. The woman never lifted her head. She never acknowledged him. The light turned green and the car accelerated, taking him away from the scene. But his mind remained stuck back there, on that sidewalk, on the ghost of a woman who could not be there. His fingers tightened around his phone, but he had stopped reading his messages. His focus had shifted completely, drawn back into a past he had spent years burying. Ethan let out a slow breath, his fingers pressing against his temple, as if he could will away the questions forming in his mind. Emily was gone. She had disappeared from his life without a trace, without an explanation. He had searched for her. He had exhausted every resource at his disposal to find out what had happened to the woman he once loved, the woman who had meant more to him than he dared to admit. And yet she had vanished as if she had never existed. He had forced himself to move on, to accept that some things in life would never have answers. But now, after all these years, a single moment on a city street threatened to unravel everything. He turned sharply toward the driver. "Pull over," he said, his voice clipped, controlled. The driver hesitated, glancing at him through the rearview mirror. "Sir, pull over now!" The car veered toward the curb, but by the time it came to a stop, the sidewalk was empty. Ethan's eyes scanned the streets, searching for the woman, for the children, for any sign of the moment he had just witnessed. Nothing. A trick of the mind, perhaps. A shadow of regret, manifesting itself in the most inconvenient way possible. His jaw clenched. He was not a man prone to illusions. Facts, logic, evidence, those were the things that had built his empire. Yet here he was, staring out at a street that no longer held the ghost he had just seen. He exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his hair, willing himself to let it go. He had a schedule to keep, an image to maintain. His life was built on structure, on unwavering control. He wouldn't allow the past to shake him, especially when it had no place in his present. "Sir, do you want me to—" "No," Ethan interrupted, settling back against the seat. "Keep driving." The car merged back into traffic, but his thoughts remained fractured. He reached for his phone again, though he no longer had the patience for unread messages and pointless reports. Instead, his thumb hovered over an old contact that no longer held any use. Emily Carter. He had called that number 1,000 times in the months after she disappeared, had traced every possible lead, had thrown money, influence, and resources at the problem only to come up empty-handed. But what if? No, he shut down the thought before it could take root. It wasn't her. It was just a woman on the street. A woman who happened to have a ring that looked like Emily's. And yet, as the city lights blurred past him, one thought refused to leave his mind. If it wasn't her, why did it feel like he had just seen a ghost? Ethan leaned back in his chair, gripping the edges of his desk with unnecessary force. His mind had been restless since the moment he saw that woman on the sidewalk. It wasn't just a vague resemblance, not just a passing similarity. It was her. It was Emily. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, an instinct so strong it threatened to suffocate him. But why? Why would she be out there, living like that after all these years? The last time he had seen her, she was full of life, standing beside him as if the future belonged to both of them. And then one day, she was gone. No explanations, no clues, just a disappearance that no amount of money or influence could undo. He had searched. God, how he had searched. And now, when he had finally resigned himself to the idea that she was lost forever, she had appeared out of nowhere, right in front of him, only to vanish again. With a determined exhale, he pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed. The line clicked after the second ring. "Find her," he ordered before the person on the other end could speak. "I want every detail, where she lives, who she's with, and I want it now." The voice hesitated before responding. "Sir, I assume you're referring to you-know-who," Ethan cut in, his voice sharp. "Emily Carter, she's here. I saw her, and I want answers." There was a brief silence before the reply came. "Understood. Give me a few hours." Ethan hung up and leaned forward, staring at nothing in particular. His fingers tapped against the polished surface of his desk, restless, impatient. What if he was wrong? What if grief was playing tricks on him, manifesting as ghosts of a past he had never truly let go of? No, it wasn't his mind deceiving him. It wasn't an illusion. It was her. It had to be. The hours, dragged by, each one filled with an unbearable weight that pressed against his chest. Finally, his phone vibrated. A text message, a single address. He inhaled deeply, his heart pounding in anticipation. Without a second thought, he grabbed his coat and headed for the door. The shelter was in a part of town Ethan hadn't set foot in for years, a place far removed from the world he inhabited. He stepped out of the car, scanning the modest brick building with calculated detachment. He wasn't here for sympathy or nostalgia. He was here for the truth. Inside, the air felt heavy with the weight of lives lived in struggle. People moved around quietly, their faces tired, their expressions guarded. He didn't belong in a place like this. He knew it, and so did everyone who stole a glance in his direction. His suit alone was enough to set him apart, but it didn't matter. He was here for one reason only. A woman behind a small desk looked up at him with mild curiosity. "Can I help you?" Ethan pulled out his phone, glancing at the name he'd been given. "I'm looking for a woman named Emily." He stopped himself, correcting his approach. "Emily Carter. I was told she lives here with 2 children." The woman's polite demeanor shifted. A layer of caution settled over her expression, though she tried to mask it. "I'm sorry," she said after a moment. "We don't give out information about our residents." Ethan exhaled, restraining his impatience. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need to see her. I'll wait outside if I have to." The woman hesitated, then sighed. "She's in the common area, but if she doesn't want to talk to you, I won't force her." Ethan didn't wait for further instructions. He walked down the hallway, his gaze scanning the space ahead. Then he saw her. She was sitting in a corner with the two little girls curled beside her. She was thinner than he remembered, her face more angular, her hair pulled back in a way that emphasized the exhaustion in her features. But it was her, and in that moment, the years between them vanished. He stepped forward, and, as if sensing his presence, Emily lifted her head. Their eyes met, and for a fleeting second something flickered in her expression: recognition, hesitation, perhaps even fear. Then, just as quickly, her gaze hardened. Ethan swallowed, pushing past the storm of emotions threatening to unravel him. "Emily," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. She didn't answer, didn't move. Her fingers curled protectively around the children beside her, and for the first time he saw it clearly. The way she shielded them, the way her body positioned itself between them and the world, between them and him. "Emily, it's me," he tried again. Her lips pressed together. "You have the wrong person." His breath hitched. "Don't do this," he murmured. "I know it's you. I saw you. I saw the ring." Emily's eyes flickered to her hand for the briefest second before she tucked it beneath the fabric of her worn sweater. "You should go." Ethan's fingers twitched at his sides. He had spent years chasing answers, only to have them thrown in his face now that he was standing right in front of them. "Why are you doing this?" "I don't know you," she said, her voice quiet, almost forced. "Please leave us." Alone, the girls shifted beside her, sensing the tension. One of them peeked up at him with wide, curious eyes, the same color as his own. His chest tightened. The truth was right there in front of him, but for some reason, Emily was refusing to acknowledge it. "I'm not leaving," he finally said, his voice steady. "Not until I get the truth." Emily exhaled sharply, her expression unreadable, but the fear in her eyes, that was something he couldn't ignore. The objective of this chapter was to create tension and mystery around Emily's identity and her reasons for hiding. The key moment occurs when Ethan confirms that it is truly Emily, but she refuses to acknowledge him, deepening the mystery even further. Ethan's eyes lingered on the two little girls, their small frames nestled closely against Emily, as if she were the only barrier between them and the world. He wasn't sure what he was expecting to feel, but an unease settled deep in his chest as he studied their faces, their movements, their expressions. He had barely been able to comprehend seeing Emily again, but now something else was clawing at the edges of his mind. One of the girls shifted slightly, looking up at Emily for reassurance, and as she turned, a tiny dimple formed in her left cheek. Ethan's breath caught. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but he saw it. That dimple was identical to his own. His jaw tightened as he forced himself to look closer. The same delicate arch of the brows, the way her nose crinkled slightly when she looked uncertain, the barely noticeable scar near her temple. Small, almost. Indistinguishable details, but ones that felt too familiar to ignore. The other girl, though not a perfect mirror of her sister, had a quiet sharpness in her eyes, an intensity that felt all too familiar. A memory flickered unbidden in his mind, his own reflection as a child, staring back at him in an old photograph. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. Ethan swallowed the knot forming in his throat. His world had been built on facts, on tangible proof, on certainty. This was uncertainty, a chaotic storm of emotions he wasn't prepared to face. He wasn't the type to indulge in assumptions, but the longer he watched them, the more the thought took root. He had spent years without answers, years believing that Emily had disappeared without a trace, leaving him with nothing but questions. And now she was here, with them, two children who could very well be his. Emily's arms tightened around the girls, as if she could sense his thoughts, her posture shifting into something more protective, more guarded. She didn't look at him, but the tension radiating from her was palpable. She knew what he was seeing, she knew what he was thinking, and yet she refused to acknowledge it. He clenched his fists at his sides, fighting the urge to demand the truth right there, right now. But something held him back. Maybe it was the way the little girl had pressed her cheek into Emily's shoulder, the way her tiny fingers clung to the fabric of her sweater. There was fear in that grasp, the kind that came from knowing what it meant to lose something. Ethan exhaled slowly, trying to ground himself in the present, but it wasn't easy. He was staring at the impossible. "Emily," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "Who are they?" Her body stiffened, her fingers curled tightly against the children's backs. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she lifted her chin slightly, a silent act of defiance. "They're my daughters," she said finally, her voice devoid of emotion. Something inside him twisted violently. It wasn't a denial, but it wasn't an admission either. His pulse pounded in his ears. They are mine," she interrupted before he could finish the question. The words were clipped, firm, meant to end the conversation. Ethan felt a surge of frustration rise within him, but he swallowed it down. "How old are they?" he asked instead, his voice deceptively calm. Emily hesitated for a fraction of a second, just enough for him to notice. "5, she said, her gaze unyielding. 5. His mind raced. 5 years. It had been a little over 6 since she had disappeared. No, he wouldn't let himself go there. Not yet. He needed proof. He needed more than a gut feeling and a resemblance that threatened to unravel everything he thought he knew. The girls remained quiet, sensing the tension between the two adults. One of them, her dimpled cheek peeking from beneath a cascade of messy curls, tilted her head slightly, observing him with a curiosity that made his stomach tighten. "Who are you?" she asked softly. Ethan's breath caught for a fraction of a second before he forced a small, controlled smile. "Just an old friend of your mum's," he said carefully, his voice betraying nothing. But inside, his world was tilting, shifting, spiraling into a place he wasn't sure he knew how to navigate. Emily's eyes burned into him, a silent warning not to say more. But the truth was already cracking through the surface. Ethan knew, and so did she. Ethan stepped forward, his gaze unwavering as he stood before Emily. She had barely moved since their last exchange, her posture rigid, her arms still wrapped protectively around the girls. He didn't want to do this here, not in front of them, but the weight of everything he had uncovered in the last 24 hours was pressing down on him, demanding answers. He had spent years believing she had vanished, accepting that she had left him without reason. But now, after finding her like this, after seeing the fear in her eyes, the way she flinched at his presence, he knew he had only scratched the surface of a much darker truth. "I need you to tell me what happened," he said, his voice controlled but firm. "I need to know why you disappeared, why I spent years looking for you only to find out you were never supposed to be found." Emily's fingers tightened slightly against the fabric of her worn sweater, but she didn't look at him. She just shook her head, the smallest movement, barely noticeable if he hadn't been watching her so closely. "There's nothing to talk about, Ethan," she said, her voice flat, devoid of the warmth he once knew. "You shouldn't be here." Ethan exhaled sharply, his patience thinning. He didn't come this far for vague responses and evasive glances. "You expect me to believe that?" His tone edged with frustration. "I had people searching for you for months. Do you have any idea how much I tried to find you? And now, I find out that you were declared dead." He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Emily, I saw the records, official documents, death certificates." His jaw clenched as he forced himself to say it. "They buried you." A flicker of something crossed her face. Fear, recognition, something buried so deeply it disappeared almost instantly. But it was there. She knew. Ethan swallowed hard, resisting the urge to reach for her, to shake some kind of truth out of her. "Who did this?" he asked, his voice quieter now, controlled. "Who made you disappear?" Emily lifted her chin, her eyes finally meeting his. But they weren't the same eyes he remembered. They were harder now, lined with years of pain and secrets she refused to share. "It doesn't matter," she whispered. "You need to let it go." His stomach twisted at her words. Let it go? After everything? After spending years believing she had abandoned him, only to find out that she had been erased? He wasn't the kind of man who walked away from things like this. He wasn't about to let it go. Ethan took a slow step back, his mind racing. If she wasn't going to tell him the truth, he would find it himself. He had the resources, the connections, the power. Someone had erased Emily Carter from existence, and he was going to find out who and why. By the time he got back to his office, his thoughts were already 2 steps ahead. His private investigator, a man named Harris who had been working with him for years, was waiting. Find everything you can on Emily Carter, Ethan ordered, throwing his coat onto the desk. No detail is too small. Cross-reference medical records, legal files, even old employment history. I want to know who she spoke to, where she was seen last, everything. Harris raised an eyebrow. I thought she's alive, Ethan cut in, his voice leaving no room for doubt. And someone didn't want me to know that. Harris nodded, already pulling out his laptop. I'll see what I can dig up. Ethan paced the room, his mind churning. He had built his career on uncovering the truth, on seeing the patterns that others missed. Someone had gone through a lot of trouble to erase Emily from existence. This wasn't just a matter of her running away. This was intentional. This was methodical. Hours passed, and when Harris finally looked up, his face was paler than usual. Sir, he said carefully, you're going to want to see this. Ethan moved to his side, his eyes scanning the screen. The report Harris had pulled up was sparse, missing key information, but the details that were there sent a chill down his spine. According to official records, Emily Carter was pronounced dead 6 years ago, Harris said, scrolling through the limited file. Cause of death is listed as an accident. No further information provided. He frowned. That's not unusual. What is unusual is the fact that there's no autopsy report, no medical examiner's sign-off, no hospital records. Ethan's jaw tightened. That doesn't make sense. It doesn't, Harris agreed. It's like someone wiped her existence clean. There's no social security activity, no bank records. It's as if on paper she just stopped existing. Ethan clenched his fists. This wasn't just a mistake. This was deliberate. Someone had ensured that if anyone went looking for Emily Carter, they would find nothing. Whoever had done this had power, influence, the kind of reach that most people didn't. Harris continued scrolling. I found something else. A flagged report. About a month before she was declared dead, Emily checked into a hospital outside the city under a different name. She was treated for a severe injury, looks like blunt force trauma. Ethan felt something dark settle in his stomach. You're saying someone tried to kill her? Harris hesitated. I'm saying it looks like she barely survived whatever happened. He exhaled, clicking on another document. And whoever was behind it didn't want her getting away the second time. Ethan straightened, his entire body rigid with tension. Emily hadn't left him. She hadn't abandoned their life. Someone had taken her away. And whoever had done this had almost succeeded in making sure she never came back. But she had. And now Ethan wasn't just looking for answers. He was looking for the people who had done this. And God helped them when he found them. Ethan didn't knock this time. He pushed the shelter door open with purpose, his grip tightening around the folder in his hand. He wasn't here for another round of evasive answers, half-truths, or silence. He had given Emily time. He had tried to let her explain on her terms, but that was over. She had been erased from existence, buried under a lie so carefully crafted that only someone powerful could have orchestrated it. And now that he had proof in his hands, he wasn't leaving without the truth. Emily was sitting in the same corner, her arms wrapped protectively around the twins as if she could shield them from whatever storm was coming. She looked up the moment he stepped closer, her entire body tensing at his presence. She had always been able to read him. She knew before he even spoke that something had changed, that he had something she wouldn't be able to ignore. Ethan, she started, already on the defensive. He placed the folder on the table between them. Read it. She didn't reach for it. She didn't even look at it. Instead, she kept her eyes locked on his, her expression unreadable. "I don't need to," she murmured. Ethan inhaled sharply, forcing himself to stay calm. "So you knew?" Emily didn't answer. He opened the folder himself, flipping through the pages with deliberate precision. "6 years ago, you were admitted to a hospital under a different name. A month later, a death certificate was issued in your name. No cause of death listed, no autopsy, nothing. Just a clean, bureaucratic erasure." He exhaled, his voice steady but edged with something dangerous. "You were declared dead, Emily. Someone made sure you disappeared." She flinched just slightly, but it was enough. Ethan leaned closer. "Who did this to you?" Emily's fingers tightened. Against the fabric of her sweater, her eyes darting briefly to the twins before settling back on him. "I can't," she whispered. His patience snapped. "Damn it, Emily. You think I can just walk away from this? You were buried. You think that doesn't matter? That I'm just going to pretend none of this happened?" She flinched again at the intensity in his voice, but she didn't look away. If anything, she seemed even more determined to hold her ground. "I did what I had to do," she said quietly. "For them." Ethan clenched his jaw. "Who are you running from?" She swallowed hard, shaking her head. "It doesn't matter." His chest tightened with frustration. "It matters to me." Emily exhaled sharply, looking away. "You don't understand." "Then make me understand," Ethan demanded, his voice quieter but no less intense. "Because from where I'm standing, the woman I loved vanished into thin air. And now I find out that someone wanted her dead. You don't get to tell me that doesn't matter." Emily's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but then she stopped herself. Instead, she reached for the folder, her fingers trembling slightly as she flipped through the documents. Her eyes scanned the death certificate, the medical records, the fragments of a life that had been erased. A long silence stretched between them before she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't supposed to survive." Ethan felt something dark settle in his chest. "What do you mean?" She closed her eyes briefly, as if bracing herself. "They didn't just want me gone. They wanted me dead." His fingers curled into fists. "Who?" Emily hesitated again, and for the first time he saw something break in her, something raw and terrified that she had been holding back for too long. But even now she still wouldn't say the name. "I can't," she whispered again. "If I tell you, they'll come for you too." Ethan's blood ran cold. He had suspected as much, but hearing her say it made it real. This wasn't just about Emily's past. It wasn't just about secrets or lost time. This was about survival. And now, he realized, it wasn't just Emily who was in danger. It was him, too. Ethan's hands curled into fists as he stared at the message on his phone. 4 words. That was all it said. "Stay away from Emily." No number, no sender, just a warning, sharp and deliberate. Whoever had sent it wasn't making a suggestion. They were issuing a command. But Ethan Montgomery didn't take orders. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to think. The timing wasn't a coincidence. He had been pressing too hard, asking too many questions, pulling at threads that someone had tried to keep buried. This message wasn't just a warning, it was confirmation that he was getting close to something. Something they didn't want him to find. His office was dark, except for the glow of his laptop screen. Files were spread across the desk, fragments of information he had pieced together from medical records, legal documents, and news archives. Emily's supposed death, the missing hospital records, the inconsistencies in her paperwork, everything pointed to a cover-up. But now someone was pushing back. Someone was watching him. His jaw tightened as he grabbed his phone and pressed a number. The line rang once before Harris, his most trusted investigator, picked up. "Sir," Harris said, his voice sharp. "Something happened?" Ethan didn't waste time. "I got a message. Anonymous. 4 words. Stay away from Emily." There was a pause on the other end, then a slow, exhaled breath. "That's not good." Ethan let out a humorless chuckle. "No, it's not. And I want to know who sent it. I'll run a trace." Harris said. "But if it's encrypted or rerouted through multiple servers, it might take time." "Then start now," Ethan ordered. Harris hesitated. "Sir, if someone's sending warnings, they're serious. You're making someone nervous." "Good," Ethan said, leaning back in his chair. "Let them be nervous." He hung up and set his phone down, staring at the text again. It wasn't fear that settled in his chest. It was something colder, something sharper. He had spent years negotiating deals, reading people, understanding when someone was bluffing and when they weren't. This wasn't a bluff. Someone wanted Emily gone. Someone had erased her existence, made sure she disappeared, and now they wanted him to stop looking. But they had made a mistake. By sending this message, they had just told him he was looking in the right place. His fingers drummed against the desk as he replayed the last few days. He had tracked down old records, spoken to people who barely remembered Emily, pieced together fragments of a life that had been wiped away. And now, just as he was closing in, they were pushing back, which meant there was still something left to hide. Another vibration against the desk, another message. "Walk away while you can." Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line. They were escalating, testing him, seeing if he would break. He picked up the phone, his fingers moving over the screen. He typed 2 words. Too late. He hit send. If they were watching, they would get his answer. He wasn't backing off. A sharp knock at his office door made him look up. Cole, his head of security, stepped inside, his face unreadable. "We've got a problem," Cole said. Ethan leaned back slightly. "Tell me." "Someone's tracking you," Cole said. "Not just your phone, your movements, your office, your house. We found signs of surveillance." Ethan's fingers tightened around his phone. "How long?" "At least a week," Cole admitted. "Maybe longer. Whoever it is, they're careful. They're watching, but they're staying out of reach." A slow, simmering anger burned in Ethan's chest. This wasn't just a warning anymore. This was a game of control. They wanted him to know they were watching. They wanted him to feel pressure. But what they didn't understand was that pressure didn't break him. It sharpened him. "They were ready for me," Ethan said. "Before I even found her. They knew I would look." Cole nodded. "And they want to scare you into stopping." Ethan exhaled slowly. "Then they don't know me at all." He stood, grabbing his coat. "Double security at every property. No one gets in or out without clearance. And put a team on Emily and the twins. Around the clock." Cole hesitated. "Sir, if we escalate..." "They already did," Ethan cut him off. "Now it's my turn." Without another word, he walked out, his mind set. Whoever was behind this had underestimated him. That was their first mistake. Their second was thinking he would ever stop. Ethan stood motionless, his eyes locked on Emily, as if she had just shattered the foundation of his entire world. The weight of her words hung between them, thick and suffocating. She had believed it was him. For years she had lived in fear, convinced that the man she once loved had ordered her. Death. The realization settled deep in his chest, burning like a wound he hadn't seen coming. Emily sat across from him, her hands curled into tight fists against her lap, her breathing uneven. She hadn't meant to say it. She had spent years carrying this truth alone, burying it so deep inside her, that speaking it now felt like reopening an old wound. But there was no taking it back. The moment had come. Ethan knew now. "You thought I tried to kill you?" His voice was quiet, but there was something raw in it, something that made Emily flinch. "After everything we had, after everything I gave, you..." He stopped himself, shaking his head, his jaw tightening as if the words tasted like poison. Emily swallowed hard, her eyes refusing to meet his. "I didn't know what to think," she admitted. "One day, everything was fine. The next, I had people coming after me, telling me I had seen too much. That if I wanted to live, I needed to disappear." Ethan leaned forward, his fingers gripping the arms of his chair. "Seen too much of what, Emily? What did you find?" Her lips parted, but she hesitated. She had spent so long running, hiding, surviving, that saying the truth out loud felt dangerous. But Ethan had come too far now. He wouldn't let this go. "It was something in your company," she finally said. "Something I wasn't supposed to see. I don't even know the full extent of it. All I know is that someone inside your world wanted me gone." Ethan exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. He had built Montgomery Industries from the ground up, securing every partnership, making sure nothing slipped through the cracks. He knew every deal, every contract, every project, or at least he had thought he did. The idea that something had been hidden from him, something dangerous enough to warrant Emily's execution, made his blood turn to ice. "You believed it was me," he said again, and this time the words weren't just a question. They were an accusation, laced with disbelief and something close to heartbreak. Emily finally looked at him. "What was I supposed to think, Ethan? I was being followed, threatened. I had no one. And when I looked for help, every door was shut. The only thing they kept telling me was that it all led back to you." His chest ached at the thought. He had spent years missing her, mourning her, thinking she had been taken from him by forces beyond his control. But she had spent those same years believing he was her enemy. "I would never have hurt you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Never." Emily's breath hitched, and for the first time doubt flickered in her eyes. Maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong all along. Maybe she had been manipulated, her fear twisted into something that had kept her away from the one person who might have been able to save her. "But if it wasn't you," she said, her voice trembling, "then who was it?" Ethan straightened, his mind already racing. If someone had used his name to cover their tracks, then it meant one thing. The real traitor, the one who had ordered Emily's execution, wasn't a stranger. It was someone inside his own company, someone close enough to have the power to make people believe he had done it. His stomach twisted at the realization. "This isn't over," he said, standing. Abruptly, "Whoever did this is still out there, and I'm going to find them." Emily watched him, something unreadable in her gaze. She had spent years believing she was running from him, but now, for the first time, she felt something shift. If Ethan wasn't behind this, then that meant the real enemy was still watching, still waiting, and they wouldn't let her escape a second time. Ethan sat at his desk, his fingers gripping the edges of the contract as his eyes scanned the page over and over again, searching for an explanation that didn't exist. His own name, signed with the same precise pen stroke he had used 1,000 times before, authorized Emily's elimination. The reality of it sent a slow, creeping chill through his veins. This wasn't just manipulation. This was betrayal of the highest order, executed by someone who had access to his power, his authority, his trust. His mind raced as he forced himself to breathe, to think, to process. Someone inside his company had orchestrated this. Someone close enough to forge his signature, close enough to use his influence as a weapon. That meant the enemy wasn't lurking in the shadows or hiding behind anonymous threats. No, they had been standing beside him all along. He clenched his jaw and pulled out a second file, flipping through reports, financial records, transaction histories. If someone had the means to fake his orders, they had also moved money, shifted assets, covered their tracks in a way that left breadcrumbs. Breadcrumbs he was about to follow. His eyes flicked to the dates on the contract. 6 years ago. That meant whoever had done this had been in his inner circle long before Emily disappeared. The list of suspects narrowed. His intercom buzzed. He ignored it. Another buzz, then a knock. "Sir?" Harris's voice filtered in through the door, controlled but urgent. "You need to see this." Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face before pressing the button. "Come in." Harris entered with a tablet in hand, his usually unshakable demeanor slightly unsettled. "We ran deeper traces on the surveillance feeds, the ones around your properties. Something changed in the last 24 hours. Ethan stiffened. "What changed?" Harris handed him the tablet. "They're not just watching you anymore. They're watching the girls and Emily." A slow, simmering fury ignited in Ethan's chest. His grip tightened around the device as he tapped through the footage. Dark. Vehicles stationed near the shelter. A figure lingering across the street longer than necessary. A different angle showed someone, hood up, hands tucked into their pockets, circling the playground where the twins had played just that morning. "They're getting bolder," Ethan muttered, his voice dangerously low. Harris nodded. "And whoever is behind this, they have resources. They're careful but not careful enough." He hesitated. "They're connected, Ethan." That word carried weight. Connected. In their world, that didn't just mean influence. It meant someone with power. Someone untouchable. Someone who thought they could erase Emily, steal years of her life. And now, they wanted to finish what they started. Ethan set the tablet down with a deliberate slowness. "We find them. We're already digging," Harris assured him. "But there's more. I pulled old financial statements from before Emily disappeared. There were irregular withdrawals, large amounts moved through shell companies. But here's the problem. These weren't just suspicious transactions. They were approved under your name." Ethan's stomach turned. "Let me guess. The same way this contract was approved." He held up the document that condemned Emily to disappear. Harris nodded. "Exactly." Ethan's head lowered slightly, the tension coiling in his shoulders like a loaded spring. "I want names," he said evenly, but there was a lethal edge to his voice. "We're close," Harris assured him. "We've narrowed it down to 3 people who had this level of access. I just need a little more time." Ethan met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "Time is something I don't have." Harris hesitated. "I know, but whoever did this, whoever set this in motion, they were smart. They made sure to cover their tracks. If we make a wrong move now, they'll see us coming." Ethan inhaled sharply through his nose. He hated waiting, hated the thought that someone, somewhere, was watching his family, his children, thinking they were still in control, thinking they could win. His phone vibrated on the desk. A new message. "Let it go, Ethan, or you lose everything." He stared at it for a long moment, a dark smile curving his lips. They were getting desperate. They should be. Because whoever was behind this, they had just made their final mistake. They had underestimated him. Ethan's hands tightened into fists as he stared at the empty room. The air was heavy with something more than absence. It was wrong, off, as if the walls themselves held the echoes of something violent. Emily was gone, but this time she hadn't run. She had been taken. His heart pounded, but his was already moving faster than his pulse. He turned sharply toward Harris, who stood near the doorway, his expression grim, his posture rigid. "How long?" Ethan's voice was low, controlled. But beneath the surface, rage simmered. Harris checked his watch, his jaw tightening. 40 minutes, maybe. Less. Security detail was down for 5 of them. Whoever did this knew the blind spots. Ethan exhaled slowly, forcing himself to think through the fury clawing at his ribs. "Surveillance footage?" "Being pulled now," Harris said. But there was no alarm tripped, no forced entry. They were in and out like ghosts. That didn't sit right. Emily wasn't careless. She had spent years running, years watching over her shoulder. She wouldn't have let herself be taken easily. That meant whoever came for her wasn't just skilled. They were prepared. Ethan's grip on his phone tightened as he dialed. "Get me Cole." The line clicked, and a deep voice answered almost immediately. "We have a problem," Cole said without preamble. Ethan's chest clenched. "I know. Give me details." Cole's voice was sharp. "The team on the girls just intercepted a car 3 blocks from the shelter. 2 men, armed. They were watching." Ethan's breath left him in a slow, deliberate exhale. "Did they take them?" "No. The girls are safe. But whoever took Emily, they had backup, Ethan. This wasn't random." Of course it wasn't. Nothing about this had been random. From the moment he had found her, from the moment he had started digging, he'd been a step behind something bigger. Someone had been waiting, watching, and when he got too close, they had moved first. Ethan turned to Harris. "Trace every call she made in the last 24 hours. Any unusual activity on her accounts, any contacts, anything she might have tried to tell someone without saying it outright. Harris nodded. We're already on it. Ethan looked back at the room, his eyes narrowing. The bed was unmade, blankets pushed to one side, as if she had been sitting there moments before she was taken. A chair had been knocked over, not much of. A struggle. Either she had been caught off guard or... He moved quickly, crouching near the bed. The carpet was slightly shifted, as if something had been dragged. His eyes scanned the floor, and then he saw it. A scrap of fabric, torn near the leg of the nightstand, dark red, blood. His entire body went still. His mind snapped into razor-sharp focus. They had hurt her. A slow, deadly calm settled over him. This wasn't just a power move anymore. This was personal. Harris's phone buzzed, and he answered immediately, listening for a moment before looking up. We have partial footage. Black SUV. Wood-tinted windows, no plates. Headed west. Ethan was already moving. Get me everything. Traffic cameras, satellite feeds, street security. I want that car found. Harris nodded, following close behind. And when we find them? Ethan's voice was quiet, cold. We take them apart. He didn't bother with explanations. Didn't need to. Emily had spent years in the dark, believing he was the threat when all along someone else had been pulling the strings. Someone had stolen years of her life. Someone had taken away his chance to know the truth before now. And now, they had taken her again. Ethan had. Played by the rules once. He had let people dictate what was too dangerous, what lines couldn't be crossed. That version of him was gone. This time, he wasn't going to ask for permission. This time, he was going to burn their world to the ground. Ethan stood in the dimly lit room, the weight of everything he had uncovered pressing against his chest like a vice. The man sitting across from him was calm, too calm. A man who had worn the mask of loyalty for years, who had stood by his side through every victory, every loss. And yet, behind that mask had been something else entirely. Deception, greed, betrayal. Ethan clenched his fists at his sides, his pulse a steady roar in his ears. It was you, he said, his voice low but edged with something dangerous. All these years. It was you, the man, James Alden, his closest advisor, his friend. Exhaled slowly, tilting his head as if he were almost disappointed that Ethan had finally caught up. I was hoping you'd never figure it out, James admitted, his expression unreadable. But I suppose it was inevitable. You were always stubborn. Ethan took a slow step forward. You forged my name, he said. You signed off on Emily's disappearance. You had her hunted, you stole 6 years of her life, and when she came back, you took her again. James didn't deny it. He merely leaned back in his chair, watching Ethan like a chess player who had already won the game. She knew too much, he said simply. And now, so do you. Ethan's jaw tightened. It wasn't just Emily, was it? His voice was cold. You were planning to take the girls next. James sighed, tapping a finger against the armrest. Do you know how exhausting it is to manage someone else's messes, Ethan? Your company, your empire. It should have been mine. But then she started asking the wrong questions, pulling at threads that were never meant to come loose. She was an inconvenience. And now, she's collateral damage. Ethan's vision blurred with rage. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to end this now. But he held himself back. He needed one more answer. Why? Why take the twins? James's expression darkened. Because they're yours, he said. And I wasn't about to let you have a legacy to come back to. If I had finished the job, you wouldn't have had anything left to fight for. Ethan lunged. The desk between them flipped as he shoved James back, slamming him into the wall. James grunted but reacted fast, striking out, his fist connecting with Ethan's ribs. Ethan barely felt it. His focus was singular. James had taken everything from him, and now Ethan was going to take everything back. They struggled, the force of their fight sending books crashing from the shelves, knocking over the glass decanter on the bar. James reached for something. Ethan didn't wait to find out what. He caught his wrist and twisted, forcing him down. James gasped in pain. "This won't change anything," he spat. "Even if you stop me, there are others." Ethan leaned in close, his grip like iron. "Then I'll find them too." A sudden sound made them both freeze, gunfire from somewhere outside. Ethan's stomach twisted. Emily, the girls. He had wasted too much time. He slammed James back once more, leaving him, gasping on the floor before racing toward the door. Outside, chaos had erupted. His men were engaged in a firefight with unknown attackers. Ethan didn't stop to think. He moved, his only thought on Emily. He found her in the back room, struggling against the man who had taken her. Ethan didn't hesitate. One shot. The man crumpled. Emily gasped, stumbling back. Their eyes met. For a fraction of a second, nothing else existed. Then she ran to him. Ethan caught her, his arms wrapping around her tightly, his hand cradling the back of her head. She was safe. She was alive, but it wasn't over. Wasn't. "Where are the girls?" His voice was hoarse. Emily looked up at him, fear in her eyes. "They took them." A cold wave of fury rolled through Ethan. James wasn't the only enemy. He had been right. There were others. He exhaled, pressing his forehead against Emily's for the briefest moment before pulling back. "We're getting them back," he said. "I swear it." She nodded, her trust hesitant, fragile, but there. And for the first time in years, Ethan knew exactly what he was fighting for. What a powerful story, right? Here at Living Narratives, we dedicate time, passion, and care to bring you stories that touch the heart and make you reflect on life. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments. What lesson did it leave you? And let us know where you're watching from. Your support is what keeps us going. So if you haven't yet, subscribe to Living Narratives and turn on notifications. That way, you'll never miss a story like this. Thank you for being part of our journey. See you in the next story.